This is Lisa from MobileTechReview, and this is the Lenovo ThinkPad T490. So big changes from the last generation T480. You know, lately with the T series, they just kind of get a new generation CPU refresh, get a little thinner, a little lighter. Well, this one certainly has gotten thinner and lighter again. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's more like last year's T480S. The S series is always a little thinner and lighter. You get the idea. So yeah, this one has lost weight. It is actually under 18 millimeters thick, so it's relatively thin, though the lines on the side are not trying to conceal the height. It might not look that skinny to you. But the bad news is no more bridge battery system. You remember that this had a built-in battery, like on the T480, and then a removable rear battery, and you could get high-capacity batteries and go to Mount Everest with a bunch of them in your backpack and be happy. That's gone in the interest, apparently, of making it even thinner and lighter. And maybe because there are so many USB power banks on the market for laptops these days, which is a non-proprietary solution, Lenovo figured you could just go that way if you want to extend runtimes. There's no more hard drive bay inside. I don't think a lot of people are going to be too disappointed now that SSD storage is both large and affordable depending on the drive that you get. So yeah, only the IT department probably loved those hard drives because they were cheaper. New, and the good stuff is that you can go all the way up to a WQHD resolution IPS wide gamut display. That's the same high-end display that's also available on the ThinkPad X1 Carbon 6th generation. There's a lot of crossover between different ThinkPad models. I'll talk a little bit to help you decide which one's for you. Anyway, we're going to look at it now. So the T490 starts at around $850 in the United States. That's for a pretty low-end configuration, a Core i5, 8 gigs of RAM, a 128 gig SSD. Okay, that's not horrible, but the base display option is, again, one that the IT department's going to pick and you would never pick because they're either on a tight budget or they don't like you. 1366 by 768, so you probably don't want that one. But if you want the configuration that we have, which is pretty high-end, a Core i7, 16 gigs of RAM, a 512 gig SSD, NVMe, and that lovely WQHD high gamut display, that's around $1,440 on Lenovo's website. You can go with 1080p. There's several display options with this. There's that 720p display I mentioned. There's our high-end display. I'll talk about the specs on that more. It's lovely. But there's also 1080p touch, 1080p non-touch, and a privacy screen is coming too. Probably they want to compete against HP because their Elites and their ZBooks have these really nice privacy screens going on, so spies can't see what you're doing when they're sitting next to you on the airplane. These are Ultrabooks, so we're talking 15-watt quad-core Intel 8th generation Whiskey-like CPU, so that's the latest generation that's available now for Intel processors. Core i5, Core i7 options are available to you. One PCIe NVMe M.2 SSD slot, so really fast SSD speeds on this. Pretty impressed with the benchmarks that we got. RAM, there is one RAM slot, and there's 8 gigs soldered on board. So our 16 gig has that 8 gigs of DDR4 2400 megahertz RAM soldered on board and one 8 gig module. So you could go all the way up to 48 gigs if you upgraded it yourself. The most that Lenovo sells it with is 32 gigs, which for most Ultrabook buyers is way more than enough, I would say. The machine has Thunderbolt 3 and a host of ports. That's one of the charms of the T series, and happily, even though it's lost that bridge battery system, I know how many times I'm going to mention that, but I think a lot of people are going to miss that. But you've got things like not only just Thunderbolt 3/USB-C, but those USB-C ports support power delivery out, so you can charge other devices. You have USB-A. You have actually an Ethernet jack. Now, if you go with the ThinkPad X1 Carbon, if you're trying to figure out which of these to buy, that one is thinner. It's lighter. It doesn't have room for an Ethernet port, for example. And the same thing is true for the ThinkPad T490S. The S is still around. It's thinner and lighter than the T490, not enough room for an Ethernet port. Those two have slightly larger batteries, 57 watt-hour. We have a 50 watt-hour battery in the T490, which is kind of average for Ultrabooks. We'll talk about battery life a little bit more. As ever, wonderful ThinkPad keyboard, smile-shaped keys, nice convex, very ergonomic, good key travel, very good keyboard deck stiffness, so there's no trampolining going on. White backlighting, it is excellent. And we have a great trackpad on board. I like it quite well. And also the usual nav point eraser stick pointer for those of you who are longtime ThinkPad users and like that pointing method. Performance on this, I wish we had the NVIDIA MX 250 graphics, which we don't see very often in laptops these days, but we don't. We just have the Intel UHD version. So performance on this is where you would expect for an Ultrabook in this class. Really, there's not a lot of variation if you're looking at the same generation quad-core 15-watt CPU in one Ultrabook versus another Ultrabook. We see when we look at PC Mark X that the graph has the clock speed going up and down as it's running the benchmark. For a while, Lenovo was really holding those CPU speeds pretty high in turbo boost, but with the Whiskey Lake processors, a little bit less. Probably in the interest of battery life too, but performance on benchmarks and real-world performance is good. The fan noise on this is well controlled. In fact, you won't hear it most of the time if you're just doing simple productivity work or surfing the web. And if you're pushing it hard, you will hear it, but it's an Ultrabook fan. It's not going to get that loud. But in general, over the years, Lenovo has improved the acoustics of the fans, and it's not a noisy machine in the least. Now we have that higher end display option. Like I said, it's the same one you can actually get on the X1 Carbon, and it is beautiful. It is glossy, unfortunately, for those of you who don't like glare much. It's non-touch also. If you want that high resolution display, you might think you can touch it because it's shiny like that, but no. But it is 100% Adobe RGB. They weren't kidding when they said that. We measured it. It's actually true. It's nominally a 500 nit display. We measured it at close to that, 469 nits, and the rest of the metrics are good. This is a wonderful display. This is something that for those of you who are doing professional photography or work for print, you actually could make use of this display in Adobe Photoshop and get your work done. It's not a real big upcharge either, but if you want to save some money, you could go with the Full HD display, or if you wanted the touchscreen option. Those are 300 nit displays. The 720p display is 220 nits. Yeah. So how about battery life on this? A 50 watt-hour battery, like I said, it's about average for its class, nothing amazing. A little bit less than the X1 Carbon and the T490S, but it's good enough with our configuration. Remember, we don't have the NVIDIA graphics, but we do have the higher resolution display, a Core i7, plenty of RAM, all that sort of thing. It's about a 7-hour laptop. So if you need more, you're going to be looking at things like power banks, or be happy the fact that it has Lenovo's usual fast charging and a 65-watt fast charger, so it can top up very quickly. Now, for those of you who are still trying to decide, do I want the X1 Carbon? Do I want this? Do I want a T490S? The T490S would be the closest to an X1 Carbon because it's even thinner and lighter. The benefit with this one is it's not quite as sexy super thin, is it? But you got the same display options on it. You've got more ports on it. So if you need those quote-unquote legacy ports, there's still something to be said for this too. And it's obviously several $100s less than an X1 Carbon is. Taking off the bottom cover involves just unscrewing the visible Phillips head screws, they're captive screws, and then prying it off with the guitar pick. And boy, for a ThinkPad, it was really hard to pry this off. Underside here with our copper shielding, and there's our internals, our battery right there. This is the single RAM slot. Mylar cover over it. There's the RAM module. M.2 SSD slot right here with our drive in place. If you went with the WAN 4G LTE, that would plug in right over there, and there's a rear nano SIM card slot by the back hinge. And the Wi-Fi card is soldered on board. We're seeing that a lot with Ultrabooks these days. It's right over here. Our heat sinks right here. Nice long heat pipe. I think that probably helps with the cooling, and a bit larger than average fan for an Ultrabook. If it did have the NVIDIA MX 250 graphics, my guess is looking at the solder traces on the board, it would be right over here and run under the heat pipe as well. So that's the Lenovo ThinkPad T490, and you know, I actually like it as a more affordable alternative to the X1 Carbon. It's not quite as thin, it's not quite as light, but it's still pretty thin, it's still pretty light. It's the usual durable ThinkPad design, the same processors, you know, inside. Performance is the same. Even your display options are the same now too. So something that starts at under $1,000 nominally and priced more like $1,200 when you start to get into the options you might want. It's pretty darn good, even if we don't have the bridge battery system anymore. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and thumbs up if you like this vid.